Happy Tuesday 10 at 10. I am your host, Richard Charpentier, and today we are answering all the questions that were sent to Bakerpedia. And we have 10 minutes to go and answer the question that were sent. So let's get started. First question is there much of a difference in the reactions of the hydrate and anhydrous types of SALP, sodium aluminum phosphate? So it's an excellent question. So just to understand the hydrate and anhydrous version of the SALP, it's the water. So basically the one that is the hydrate has more water, so therefore the concentration of sodium, the sodium aluminum phosphate, basically a phosphate. So the one without the anhydrous, no water particles attached to the compound will take more. Basically with the concentration, the one with the water will need to use more versus the other one. I don't have the rate. I can look into it, but they establish the same rate of reaction, except it's a concentration that changes, not the rate. So if you were to use one versus the other, it's basically a concentration. That's basically what it is. So, but great question. You know, leavening acids are very essential and used quite a lot in the industry, and often, no, we rarely see both the hydrate or the anhydrous being offered in the bakery industry in the US. And but it's a good question. Thank you. Next question. Baker's percent. I have a technical question. If you're using a fermented starter in the recipe, how do you know the flour content of the ferment? And how is this represented in a 100% recipe? A fermented starter. So basically, if you have a fermented starter in your recipe, you need to know how much flour you're using and how much water. If it's a fermented starter you're using. So, because you can't just grab ingredients and throw them together and say, it's a little bit of water, a little bit of, because it's all about, especially if you have a production, it's all about precision, understanding, you know, what are you doing and trying to repeat to create consistency within your system. If it is, you know, the flour, to understand the flour content, if you're buying a pre-fermented from someone, you should have specifications with sort of a breakdown of the nutritional, so it gives you an indication. But if it's something you make, I highly recommend that you start measuring or scaling how much water goes in, and for the pre-ferment, so you can better adjust for your dose, so they're consistent. But I'm not 100% sure of the question. So and I wish I could help, but thank you for sending your question. Next question: how can I measure vinegar if I want to use it as a preservative in my cake? So vinegar to be used in cake is, I've seen it being done. And how do you measure it? It's going to have to be very, very, very tricky, because what you're trying to do, you're trying to lower the overall pH for preservation. And vinegar, you know, when you're using cakes, in cakes, we're using baking powder. Baking powder is baking soda with some different leavening acid, usually double acting. And now you're introducing vinegar. And I'm sure you've all done it in the past, you know, the reaction of baking soda and vinegar, you put it together and what happens, it starts foaming. So once you start putting vinegar in cake products, it's going to start basically reacting your leavening system. And as soon as you start reacting, your leavening system is going to change. You're going to lose some of the volume because you're going to release some CO2 early on because of the vinegar. So Uh, I'm not recommending to use vinegar. There are other acids that could be used. You have sodium propionate is being used. Sorbic acid, although will just affect the pH slightly, but understanding where's your pH and where do you end up with a vinegar into it. And if it's used in a cake, that's going to create other issues that you might get some help, but it's too fast of an acid. It's too reactive for your system, unless it's a type of cake with no leavening system. In this case, you might be okay, but not having enough information that you provided, I can only say do not use it because it will react with your baking powder or your baking soda in your system, and therefore changing the the finished product of your cakes. Next and last question: what is the formula to calculate the theoretical ppm propionic acid in the bread recipe with a certain amount of calcium is added? What is the formula to calculate uh, uh, how much propionic acid? Well, the calcium propionate, it's usually, if you look at your specification when you buy it, they'll break it down to sort of how much propionic acid. As you put it into your bread recipe, it dissociates to turn from calcium to propionic acid, which is the preservation that you need for your bread. So, in terms of the formula to calculate, I don't have that formula to calculate and to see how much propionic acid gets from the calcium propionate you're buying. What's the concentration of propionic acid within the calcium propionate? Look at the MSDS, look at the specification from your vendors, and look online. I'm sure you'll find a lot of information about propionic and what different type of who's selling different concentration, but they do not have a formula for calculation. So again, that was the last question, so I thank you all for being part of the Bakerpedia and also watching Tuesday 10 at 10, and I wish you a wonderful day. Happy baking, and we'll see you next week. Thank you.